Madam Speaker, in a world where the entire global community is targeting Israel and is saying that the atrocities committed by Israel as a nation and the fact that it is becoming and has become a Zionist militant state is not correct. When you have countries like Germany, which earlier used to pay reparations for the guilt of the Holocaust, now saying that you are doing the very same thing which we did to you, and it becomes problematic, right? But Angela Merkel tells Netanyahu that do not take away the blame from Germany for the guilt of Holocaust and put it on Palestinians. We think these are statements which show a more militant Israel, right? And we think it's very important for the US to pivot away from this support, right? Because currently the US is one of the only allies on an international scale with any kind of power that Israel has, right? What do we mean by the US pivoting away from Israel, right? One, increased criticism of Netanyahu and his policies, right? Increased criticism of the fact that he is blatantly saying that any action which is against Israel's interest will be dealt with brute force, right? When he says, how are you going to solve the Palestinian problem, and large amounts of ambassadors have gone ahead and says, we're okay with the human cost as long as Israel maintains its state's integrity, right? We think in a world where we believe in human rights and we believe that killing of innocent lives is not a price to pay for state's integrity, we think greater criticism of Netanyahu is one step, right? Secondly, right, stop a blanket veto on any resolution in international forums against Israel, right? We're saying the US should do it on an issue-by-issue basis, right? As of now, any statement which is perceived by Israel as against its interest is vetoed by the US, right? We think this kind of blanket dependency ensures that the world and everyone sees Israel as immune, right? It stops our ability and it stops us as a rational people of the world to build the kind of standards or build the kind of consolidation approach we need to stop the kind of atrocities, right? Thirdly, right, we need to put more pressure on Israel. We think the US should put more pressure on Israel through bilateral talks to try and, one, reduce the kind of atrocities committed against the people of Palestine, and secondly, to become less militant in its approach in the Middle East, right? When it says that, listen, if Iran has a nuclear program, even if it's a civil nuclear program, we're going to send our planes to bomb them because we don't think they have a right, right? We think all of these statements, right? We think all of these show an increasingly hostile, increasingly militant Israel, which we think is kind of problematic, right? No, right? What has Israel been doing which the world has been condemning, right? We think there are three basic things, right? One, they're forcibly ethnically settling Israeli Jews into the Gaza Strip, right? Something which they acquired through war, right? We think this is the kind of ethnic cleansing, right? An ethnic crowding out of Palestinians, where they shut down their water supplies, where they don't give them electricity, where they demolish buildings and all of these, right? We think this is very similar to the kind of stuff which the US has been criticizing China for doing with the Uyghur Muslims, right? When the US says, listen, this kind of ethnic cleansing is why we don't believe China has a human rights record, it's hypocritical of the US, because in the same breath then they support or they tacitly approve of the kind of stuff, the similar kind of stuff that Israel does, right? Second, what are we basically going to talk about in our constructive arguments, right? We're going to talk to you about the kind of the global pressure that is being put on Israel right now, right? We think a large number of European countries like Germany, like Sweden, and like the European Union are going ahead and putting pressure and criticizing Israel and its policies, right? But why does this not achieve any ends in status quo, right? Because of two things, right? One, because Israel and the world knows that one of the largest, most powerful superpowers is never going to take any action. A superpower which has the ability to veto any kind of resolutions, veto any kind of global cohesive action or sanctions against Israel, right? It is basically a get out of jail free card for Israel, right? As funny as that sounds. And we think that's largely problematic, right? Because then Israel knows that the global community has no leverage, right? We think the moment US withdraws this kind of support, it is easier to build the kind of consensus, right? Secondly, right, we think it is also in the US, it's going to benefit the United States, right? Why? Because currently we've seen a transition in the foreign policy of the United States, right? From actively intervening in the Middle East or in any place outside US borders, from actively saying that we are going to ensure peace and stability, the US has taken a less hostile approach, right? For example, when they refused to put boots on ground in Syria, right? The US is realizing that active intervention in international scenarios actually makes the situation much worse, right? Therefore, we think there is a need for a peaceful solution. We think the presence of a highly militant Israel is antithetical to a peaceful Middle East, right? We think it increases tensions, right? We think it makes Iran more hostile and therefore more militant, right? We think it forces Iraq to go ahead and spend more money on military development programs because they're afraid that a more militant Israel is going to affect them, right? We think all of these countries are still reeling from the shock of losing the Six-Day War, where all of them lost to Israel, and Israel has only become increased its military presence, right? We think the kind of instability that gives in the Middle Eastern region is something we're not okay with, right? Fourthly, right, what is this going to achieve, right? One, like we've spoken about, it's going to change the perception of the unity as Israel. Secondly, right, it's going to force internal change within the Israeli establishment, right? We think that there are some figures within the Israeli establishment who talk against the kind of military Zionist policies, right? But these people are always crowded out because the people in power have the kind of funding and the kind of US support which ensures that they keep winning elections, right? We think there's a need to look into the internal dynamics of Israel and force a dialogue within there which says that if we start doing this, our country is going to be worse off, right? We need to create internal change within Israel, and that's something which is only possible if there is international pressure which is not shielded by the United States, right? Thirdly, right, we think it prevents countries like Iran and like terrorist organizations like the ISIS from using Israel and a militant Israel as a propaganda machine to create global peace. I'm so sorry, go.
Do you think the US needs an ally in the Middle East, and if not Israel, who do you think they should pivot to?
Okay, firstly, right, we think the US has a large number of allies in the Middle East, right? We think, for example, the presence of Turkey. We think we're increasing, the West is also increasingly building better relationship with Iran, right? We think in all these cases, right, we think the presence of an ally in the Middle East does not mean that Israel has to be an ally, right? Because in this scenario, because in earlier times when we were actively apprehensive of the Middle East and needed someone to control them militarily, Israel was the perfect ally, right? But we're moving away from those times, right? We're moving away from the times when this threat of military things is making things better. We think they're making things much worse, right? We think they're forcing countries which should be peaceful coexisting neighbors to militarily arm themselves because of the threat of violence, and we think that's problematic, right? But coming back to what I was talking about, right? You think it prevents organizations like ISIS from using the kind of thing, using the threat of Israel. Is that 7 or 6? We're using the threat of Israel to go ahead and attack America, right? America and Israel are seen as the same face, and therefore it prevents the Middle East from approaching America in the same way if we criticize them. For all these reasons, we are really proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So before that, just one note. So if you were to offer to your eyes, please try to use the mic, right? So we're able to hear you better. Right. So also remember when you're giving speeches, please talk into the mic. If you look down, you'll think you might forget.
Is this fine?
Yep. Okay. So thank you, Prime Minister. Leader of Opposition, please.
Can I start? Yeah. Madam Speaker, we think it's quite interesting that opening government predicates any of the harms it talks about on having a more militant Israel, because that's exactly the case from opening opposition, right? We think the pivot of the United States away from Israel creates a sense of abandonment in the Israeli sentiment, and we think that is what results in a more militant Israel. I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm first going to give you characterization that you should have gotten an opening government as to how the Israeli identity has been constructed as being in opposition to the rest of the Middle East, as being victims of crimes that are therefore being victimized. I'm going to secondarily talk to you about how the US was a checking mechanism on the irrationality based on which these people, the Israelis have generally operated, and thirdly tell you how you're going to create a rogue state, right? But first, the characterization. We think Israel has always painted itself and its national identity as being the protector of the Jews and the sole place where Jews are safe, right? We think Aliyah, for example, that gives every Jew the right to migrate from wherever in the world they live to Israel, means that Israel is now seen or sees itself as being the one place where Jews are safe and where Jewish interests can be legitimately protected, right? Which means that the way the Israeli identity has been constructed is as being in opposition to all those countries that supposedly hate it, right? The identity of being
hating the Zionist regime is predicated on hating Iran because supposedly the existence of the Iranian state is predicated on wiping out the existence of a Zionist regime, right? We think what that means is that the basic identity based on which like the decisions are made in Israel, for example, is this victimization and the need to protect yourself, right? We think this has also resulted in the prioritization of Jewish interests and the idea that the Israeli state should only pander to Jewish interests because they are the one community that need to be protected within that country, right? We think it's resulted in a resurgence of right-wing politics where the only interest group that the government seems to care about, and the only interest group who can gain any political traction in that country are right-wing political parties who pander to Jewish interests, right? Second, let's talk about how the US was a checking mechanism before this pivot away. Because we also disagree with what the way they paint what this pivot away really means, right? We don't think it's merely Obama like saying bad things about how the Israeli state has behaved in certain situations. We think it goes beyond that, in terms of just not really engaging with the Israeli state anymore, right? In terms of actively signing a nuclear arms deal or a nuclear deal with Iran and appearing to be conciliatory with the mortal enemy of the Israeli state, right? We think it amounts to an active deprioritization and telling Israel that you really don't matter as much as you did 10 years ago and that we're perfectly fine without you, right? What we think this means is that the US, which was hitherto a checking mechanism on Israel, simply goes away. It was a checking mechanism in two ways, right? First, we think there was a perception in Israel that there is a safety net, which is that if something goes wrong and that one enemy who comes to attack us, or Iran builds a nuclear bomb and threatens to like bomb Tel Aviv, there will be this one big country who will come and save us, right? We think that perception played a large part in determining that, because the one interest that Israel has is self-preservation, right? The perception of the Israeli state is that it is always under attack because the Jewish identity is antithetical to the rest of the countries that operate around it, right? Which means that for it to say that there is this one big country, which is the United States, that will come and save it if the big bad Iranian state decides to throw a nuclear bomb on Tel Aviv, means that it was willing to make small concessions against its irrational stance, right? You see how they shifted from being nuclear ambiguous without disclosing whether or not they hold nuclear weapons to admitting in the international forum that they have nuclear weapons, right? We think this was a disclosure that was made because the United States had the ability, or the fact that the US was now willing to see or like to make a more rational state out of Israel. Sit down, please. Secondarily, we think this incentive for the US to put this pressure comes from the fact that wherever the US goes, international attention follows, right? We think the media, the American media, which dominates the world media to a large extent, it permeates through the entire world, has an interest in the way the American state views things, right? Which means that which is why we think the comparative here is North Korea, right? Where the US simply hasn't engaged with North Korea, and that's why there is no media attention on what's happening in North Korea, right? We think the comparative here is that when the US was engaging with Israel, and the US engaged with like the ideas of Israel, there was so much international pressure in terms of the media being there, and in terms of the Security Council and the General Assembly viewing American action more strictly than any other country's action. We think what that meant was that the US also had an interest in placing pressure on Israel to appear more rational and not to appear like an irrational country that's simply scared of a threat that didn't really exist. Go.
What would North Korea currently be without active Chinese support? And do you think Israel can find an ally which will face global pressure for that end?
Madam Speaker, we think in the absence of Chinese support, we don't think Chinese support to North Korea is similar to American support to Israel. We think they're fundamentally different. But second, in the absence of Chinese support, or in the absence of a stabilizing factor, we think any of these rogue states would go worse, right? Which is my third primary constructive, which is that in the absence of this checking mechanism, we think they're simply going to get a lot worse, right? We think this happens on two levels. First, that they have a tendency to operate irrationally, and this is going to simply get exacerbated, right? We look at how Israel invested millions in building the Duma nuclear reactor simply because there was, the Duma nuclear reactor, which was primarily the investment the Israeli state made, which was like millions of dollars of investment based on like unconfirmed reports that Iran was building a nuclear weapon, right? We think the fear that has permeated the way decisions are made in Israel means that when this is now compounded by the fact that the one ally they had, the one safety net they had that was checking on them, and the one person they had who could save them would like go away, is now gone, means that they're more likely to make these irrational international decisions and to act the way they acted when there was simply a threat of an Iranian state or having Iran bomb them, right? But we think secondarily this will further worsen all the harms Ashish talked about in terms of the way they act in Palestine, etc., right? Because, and this is important, right? The Israeli state and the way Israeli politics works, the Israeli identity works, is predicated on protecting Israeli interests, which means that minority interests are always deprioritized in a pure right-wing political sentiment where there is no space for any liberal or left-wing idea that tries to prioritize the interests of minorities in that country, right? What this means is that when that right-wing rhetoric now gets this additional boost of saying that we are under so much more of a threat because the one country who was there for us is also not there for us anymore. The one country who was there for us has now signed a deal with the enemy and is siding with the enemy. You think it becomes so much more easy for them to use the rhetoric that already supports things like conscription in Israel to get more public support to act in a lot worse manner on Palestine, right? We think internally, simply because Israel does not care about international pressure the way they think they would, this is going to happen, right? We think Israel is motivated fundamentally by this irrational fear of them being under attack, right? We don't think Ashish has been able to characterize how international pressure comparatively works in the context of this threat, right? Because we think when you look at it comparatively, when there is international pressure not to do one thing, but the idea that your fundamental existence and identity is challenged by the existence of a threat in Palestine, we think Israel is more likely and in every situation will act in its self-interest and not really care about international pressure, right? Which is why we think the international isolation that is going to be a consequence of this is going to arise out of this isolation. We're very proud to oppose.
Is this fine? Is this fine? Am I audible? Check. Yeah, this is fine, right? We reject the characterization by opening opposition regarding how Israel can all of a sudden become a state as insular as North Korea without taking into account the other factors that differentiate North Korea from Israel, right? But more importantly, before I go on to rebut them, the one question that they did not answer in light of a characterization of the kind of violations of human rights that is going on in Israel is that if you don't do this, how exactly are you going to put or pile up any kind of pressure on Israel? And in absence of any argumentation in LO on that particular thing, we don't think that argument stands on opening opposition and they should get any credit for that. But more importantly, what is the argument that they have made? That all of a sudden the moment you go ahead and criticize Israel, it is going to become insular, it is going to go ahead and become even more militant. We tell you that is not going to happen for at least three reasons. First of all, we tell you that the world does not exist in a vacuum and Israel is not a container, like airtight container in a sea or an ocean, right? We tell you Israel is dependent not just on EU and US for trade ties, which is the first layer of any kind of pressure that you put through soft power, but at the same time, it is dependent on US and a lot of other countries for military intelligence sharing. More importantly, we tell you more than that, Israel has had historical ties from the US, and the moment you go ahead and the moment United States goes ahead and dissociates itself from Israel, it creates two discourses at the very least. First of all, the people within Israel are forced to question why exactly is that an ally of Israel, which has gone ahead and stood with us for so long, has all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but gone ahead and distanced itself from us. We tell you what it forces the people within Israel to do is to have an argument and engage with the idea that what Israel is currently doing is not for self-preservation, and we tell you the moment you have this discourse, it is much less likely that you are going to be polarized. Because the idea that everything Israel does is for self-preservation is as ridiculous as Donald Trump's idea that the white people in America are threatened and and therefore we need a white America again, right? But more importantly, more than just that discourse, what else are these things going to do, right? First of all, we tell you that the moment you go ahead and criticize Israel, you go ahead and make sure that Israel cannot get away with the kind of things it does. But why does it get away with the kinds of things that it does? First of all, we tell you Israel has for far too long played on the guilt of the Holocaust, because of which a lot of countries, including previously in Europe and even now in the United States, have not criticized Israel. We tell you, just because something happened in 1945 which the world stands against, it does not give you the license to go ahead and actively commit human rights violations. The kind of violations like actively going ahead and demolishing the house of anything who you think is not an ally of Israel, or who is doing something that is possibly against your interest, to letting your soldiers go ahead and as much as defecate in the houses that they go ahead and attack. More importantly, what happens in the absence of this? In the absence of this, if Israel keeps getting the support of United States of keeps getting the support of United States of America, it does two things. It crowds out criticism from other countries in Europe and the rest of the world, because now these countries are going to think that the moment we go ahead and criticize Israel, we also have to go ahead and we will also face tensions with the United States. And no country right now wants to take upon the burden of going ahead and being engaged in any kind of soft or hard conflict with the United States. More importantly, it also prevents international organizations like the Human Rights Council and probably other NGOs like Amnesty and other things from actively coming into these areas and criticizing Israel, because to a large extent the ability of these organizations is based on the kind of funding and the kind of countries who give them funding. Therefore, if the countries and the people who fund these particular organizations don't want to fund them because they think if you go ahead and expose the kind of violations that are going on, in that case you're going to face possible repercussions from the United States, you are less likely to do that. Before that, I'll take closing.
Is Israel necessarily going to prioritize its relationship with the US, or the idea that they need to protect the Jewish identity?
Thank you. We tell you that the protection of the Jewish identity is the carb which has allowed Israel to perpetuate crimes for quite a long time, right? But more importantly, how exactly do people within Israel perceive themselves as something that they have also mischaracterized, right? We don't think all Israelis are right-wing. We think it is extremely demeaning for them to go ahead and believe that everyone in Israel is as right-wing and as Hobbesian in their outlook of the world, where they only have to look on self-preservation. We give you examples like Rabin and in the 90s, when Israel had a much more conciliatory tone, which not just allowed for a better discourse to happen within Israel, but also gave a much better and a more stable Middle East, right? We tell you the only reason why Israel right now is the kind of country that Israel is because this right-wing rhetoric and vitriol against any opposition to them has been constantly drowned out by rhetoric. Because every time you question Israel on anything or any of the human rights violation, you do this, you invoke the picture of the Holocaust, and we tell you that the prerequisite for you to go ahead and change the mindset of the Israeli people as this bunch of people who are scared for their lives is by telling them that you need to engage in constructive discussion and not hide behind this guilt of Holocaust, right? Finally, a more stable Middle East. We have told you that the United States has been actively disengaging itself from the Middle East. We give you examples of how it has tried to disengage itself from Afghanistan previously. It did not go ahead and put boots on the ground in Syria. Even when it did in Libya, Obama did go to the Congress and take their support, and even then it was very limited intervention. In the light of the United States backing away actively from being engaged in the Middle East, we need a more stable Middle East. How is this going to lead to a more stable Middle East? Three ways. First of all, what it is going to do is that this is going to go ahead and allow other countries to engage with Israel, because in status quo they cannot engage with Israel, because if they engage with Israel, their population is going to think, look, you are engaging with a country that is so militant, that is killing people from our religion. This inability of a lot of countries to be publicly seen, and look at the example, Egypt and Israel at one given point in time had to go ahead and in secrecy go ahead and make deals, right? We tell you it allows a lot of countries to engage constructively with Israel the moment you allow Israel to be criticized. Secondly, it makes it more stable, because it allows more intelligence and information sharing between Israel and these other countries. And thirdly, we tell you it reduces conflict within Israel, which not just makes it a better place for investment, but also makes it an avenue, makes it a place where you can bring in more and more money. And we think that the more money you bring to a place, the less incentive is there for conflict, as a consequence of which these are the benefits. Finally, another other argument Ashish gave that there was no engagement on is how this militant Israel is used as a propaganda tool by radical Islamists in this world to go ahead and coalesce themselves against the Western world, against US, against Israel, and try to create a rhetoric where the world is coalescing against Muslims. We tell you, for all these reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM. Yellow, please.
Am I audible?
Be closer to the mic, that's all. Raise it, raise it.
Hello.
Yeah, we've told him stuff.
Madam Speaker, if side government plans on winning this debate by telling us about all of the bad things that Israel is doing, it's a really bad strategy. Because we acknowledge that there are faults in the way that the Israeli government conducts its management of minority affairs. We acknowledge that there are issues with the Israeli government not being willing to engage on a regular basis on international platforms. The comparative we have to look at is whether the US distancing itself completely from Israel is actually going to lead to Israel responding to this distancing by wanting to be a more cooperative state in the international community, or whether it is more likely to perceive this as an abandonment and only fuel the sort of right-wing tendencies within this nation that they are so afraid of and lead to it becoming more of a rogue nation, which we think is far more of a threat to the international community. A few points of rebuttal before we get to our six standards. They tell you that international pressure can currently not exist because countries are so afraid of challenging anything that is allied to the United States. We tell you international pressure currently exists on Israel because international attention goes wherever the US puts down its interests, right? And the comparative to this is so many human rights violations that take place across the world in countries that simply aren't viewed as important actors in the sort of economic sense that Israel is because of its interests and because of its ties to the United States. This is true for North Korea, this is true for several regimes within sub-Saharan Africa, but they simply don't get the kind of international attention or the kind of international pressure because there is no need to criticize the hypocrisy of the United States supporting a nation that is espousing causes that go against what it claims to support in the international arena. Right? But we also tell you that if their plan is that, okay, the US will now pivot away from Israel and the international community, even if they have incentive to continue paying attention to what is happening in Israel, we can now place pressure on it, they fail to understand how international law works, right? Because international law only applies to those who opt into it. It is perfectly legitimate and possible for a country to choose to isolate itself from the sort of international institutions that exist, to not obey UN Security Council resolutions, to not obey UN General Assembly resolutions, and to not care generally about the sort of distancing that is coming from the international community, because there is no forcefulness of these measures when a country simply does not value the kind of benefits that come out of being a part of this international community, if it does not value liberalization and interaction with other members of the international community. Because Israel is different from other nations in this sense, in that we've told you repeatedly that its primary interest is this perceived threat to its self-preservation that it always wants to fight against, right? So we also tell you that they can't argue that this pivot away will hurt Israel so much that it will reform its treatment of minorities, right? Because we tell you that while Israel does value US military support in that it secures its security interests, it also views the Palestinian and Arab population as posing a more urgent and existential threat to the existence of its state. So when it comes to a prioritization of US interest or US support or US being an ally to Israel and it having to cut down on fighting what it perceives to be an existential and urgent threat to its state, it will most certainly not care about US pivoting away, and it will only fuel the sort of right-wing discourse that is getting so much prominence in Israel, that the rest of the international community does not understand our victimization, that it does not understand the kind of war that is being waged against the Israeli state, and it will only give impetus to that kind of rhetoric. We've told you that they fail to understand why Israel is so different from every other nation because of its historical context. Because 70 years of propaganda since the creation of the Israeli state has predicated the identity of the Israeli state on the notion that they are victims, on the notion that they suffered one of the worst atrocities against humanity that this race has ever viewed, right? And we tell you that you cannot undo those 70 years of propaganda to now say that they will value other things like economic interest or like being part of the international community more than securing themselves against threats to the Jewish state, to the Jewish identity, and to the Jewish race, right? So we tell you that this prioritization of their security interests, of these perceived threats, has led the Israeli state to often make irrational decisions based on this sense of victimization, right? So when it perceived that Iran was going to build nuclear weapons, even though there was absolutely nothing to suggest that it was, it invested billions of dollars into creating its own nuclear arsenal. We don't think that was necessarily the smartest move in their economic interest, but we tell you because this sense of victimization is so predominant, it often does prioritize it over any other interest.
Ma'am.
Before I move on, close.
Why does a pivot away from Israel mean the USA cannot provide military support to Israel in times of need necessarily?
Because this is what we characterize as the pivot away from Israel, right? Because the existing links between the United States and Israel are the aid that it provides to Israel, are the economic arms deals between them, are the military support that it leads to Israel. So if they're going to squirrel this motion and say that a pivot away from Israel includes them providing military aid to Israel, they've clearly lost this debate. So insofar as the US has remained an ally of Israel, we tell you that it has acted as a check on the Zionists or on the far-right factions of the Israeli political class. Because US being an ally to Israel secures Israel's most prioritized interest, which is the security of its nation. Which means it has been willing to make small and incremental changes to the way it conducts its affairs, as long as it knows that it is not abandoning the international community and it does have this support from the United States, right? An example of this is that it was willing to disclose the fact that it was creating a nuclear arsenal, and that this pressure did come from the United States and from the international community, which can only continue to exert pressure on Israel as so long as the United States keeps bringing attention to the situation that is occurring within that country, right? So we agree that the proliferation of settlements and the war against Palestinians has not been stemmed to the extent that is desired. But we tell you that the international attention to this issue or to this conflict comes because of US involvement. Because the comparative is so much worse. Because nobody has any incentive to pay attention to a rogue state oppressing minorities who don't have a voice of their own, unless there's the involvement of the superpower or the most powerful nation in the world that is hypocritically supporting Israeli proliferation of settlements in Gaza, right? We tell you the reason we know what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank is because of media attention being drawn to the hypocrisy of the United States. The reason we can have a conversation about the extent of international intervention that is adequate and that is necessary in this situation is because there is information flowing out of that conflict because of the United States involvement, because of the limited amount of pressure that the United States is able to continuously exert on Israel in exchange for providing it with this military security. We tell you lose all of those checking mechanisms and you only push Israel further away and make it more paranoid about its status and about its security in the international arena. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Diallo. Member of Government, please.
No. Madam Speaker, the case today that has come from opening government is that they want to stop Israel from doing bad things. From closing government, we have a larger ambition, a broader goal. We want to bring peace in the Middle East. I would explain to you how holding Israel accountable
will lead to a more meaningful Middle Eastern policy for the United States and will lead to resolving the conflict in the Middle East that has gone on for the last 50 years. I would then extend that argument and tell you why it's important to stop foreign policy as a large thing being dictated by wealth and economic interests, and how that goal will also be served by this move. But before that, let's deal with opening government schemes, right? We don't think they correctly understand what a pivot away from Israel means. Right now, Israel is prioritized by the United States as the only important actor in the Middle East. We think that a pivot away from Israel does not mean abandoning Israel altogether, but it means that you treat Israel as an equally important actor as all other actors in the Middle East, and you don't prioritize them the way you are currently prioritizing them. Which means that opening opposition's entire case that without US's protection, Israel will become more radical is not likely to happen for a simple reason, right? In order for US to protect Israel, it doesn't need to be pivoted in favor of Israel. It can do so while treating Israel as an equally important actor in the Middle East. So now, if Iran and Iraq violate international law and attack Israeli territory, USA will say, yes, in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions and Article 2 of the Charter, we will come to your aid and protect you from this violation of international law. But if Israel does this to other nations like Iraq and Iran, then the USA will also come to their aid and protect them from Israel's actions because it is treating them as an equal actor. We think that Israel will understand this distinction because pivoting away doesn't mean abandoning them altogether, right? That's why you don't make Israel more irrational. In fact, this move now forces Israel to come to the negotiating table because they know they can't get away with rocket bombing Palestinians and then getting a Security Council veto against any sanction against them, which means that they are forced to engage in meaningful discussion. We tell you that Israel cannot ignore USA right now because all their investment, their arms and their aid come from the USA. So yes, sure, they may throw their hands up and whine like a little child initially, but we believe that they will understand the importance of the USA in this larger scheme of things, and because the USA is not abandoning them altogether, but simply treating them as an equal, they will eventually come around, right? Not taken, right? The opening government has largely dealt with the idea of holding Israel accountable. They've told you about how Israel has been bombing Iraq's power plants, it's been encroaching on Jordanian territory in the east and into Golan Heights in the north. They've mistreated Palestinians at multiple levels. They've developed a secret nuclear program, right? The problem is that the US has so far been using its economic and political clout to protect them and not having them being treated as an equal player in the international field, and therefore they have faced no consequence, right? Why is that important in the context of a meaningful Middle Eastern policy, right? And this is something really important which no one has talked about. What is the ideological importance of Israeli territory for other Middle Eastern countries? Let's talk about Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem has this really cool thing called the Dome on the Mount, which is really important for all Muslim countries that surround it. Why? Because that dome on the mount is where Muhammad went to heaven from. So all the Muslim countries around it think that that piece of land is really, really important. What has Israel done with relation to that land? It's taken it illegally by declaring independence in 1945 when there were negotiations going on between Middle Eastern countries and Israel on the proper division of Jerusalem, and after that it has hoarded it off, limited access to it for other Muslims, regulating them, forcing them into ghettos in Jerusalem and providing them poorer public services. What does that mean, right? It means that the Middle East and all of the Middle East distrusts Israel and the way Israel treats Muslims. What happens when the USA starts protecting Israel and shielding Israel from other criticism? It means that the USA is now seen as biased against Muslims as well, and therefore there is distrust against the USA. Look, the unique thing about the USA is that its economic and political clout make it the best mediator in international relations, right? Which means that it is the most capable entity at solving the problem in the Middle East. But when an entire side of the Middle East distrust the USA because they are seen as hypocritical, because they aren't holding Israel to the same standard, and because they don't understand the Muslim countries' problems, because they're shielding the same people who have oppressed Muslims and who have conquered illegally territory that Muslims hold very dear to them. Those Muslim countries are not likely to engage with the USA, but see everything that comes from the USA as a solution, as something that is biased, that is contrary to their interests, that is not going to help them in the long run, which means that negotiations falter. It also means that Israel has no incentive to come to the negotiating table because they know that USA is always holding their back, which means that both parties to this negotiation are in conflict and don't trust each other. The moment that USA pivots away from Israel, because of its important political and economic clout, it will be seen as more trustworthy, it will be seen as less hypocritical, because they're not seen as disingenuous, where they portray that they protect self-determination, but at the same time don't allow Israel Israel to give Palestinians their right to self-determination. They will be seen as fairer and more legitimate, and therefore any negotiation that will come out under the auspices of the USA is likely to be more successful and lead to more cooperation between these two blocs and create peace in the Middle East.
So,
Before I get to my second point, I'll take closing. No, you don't have, okay.
Yeah. So, the Israeli state will just pivot towards Arab states as a threat to its essential security because it views itself in complete opposition.
No, because USA is saying that we are not abandoning you, we are treating you as equals, we will provide you with equal protection, so if the Arab states come and attack you, we will provide you military support, but if you attack them, we will also provide them equal support, because we're pivoting away from you, we're not abandoning you, we are treating you as equal to them. We think that's very clear, right? Which brings me to my final extension, right? Stopping foreign policy from being dictated by wealth, right? The reason why the USA has considered Israel so important, which no one has discussed so far, is purely economic, right? Because a huge portion of US's wealthy population is Jewish. Their banks, their Wall Street companies, jewelers, lawyers, doctors, all of these are Jewish largely, right? The importance is that we think that foreign policy should not be dictated by economic considerations, but should be dictated by values like human rights, by creating peace, by respecting self-determination, and these values should not be compromised. So far, the USA has been compromising on these values for economic concerns. We think that when the USA does pivot away from Israel and says we will not allow economic considerations to dictate these values which are more important, it sends a strong message to the international community because of the political power that the USA holds in that community, telling people that it's not okay to compromise your foreign policy and issues of universal interest for something like money, which means that because the USA is the big daddy in international relations, that precedent will serve as an important signaling effect, on other countries and the way they frame their policy, right? For all these reasons, because we think that a pivot away from Israel does not mean abandoning Israel and will still offer protection to Israel, because a pivot away from Israel means a more comprehensive solution in the Middle East, and because of the important message it sends in terms of how foreign policy is to be determined, we are very, very proud to propose.
thank you, Member of Government. Member of Opposition, please.
Madam Speaker, before we deal with what's going to be exclusively our extension on closing off, right, let's understand that what Vanchit and what CG said at closing doesn't make too much sense, right? Because apparently US is the big daddy of international relationships, right? One that stopped existing way back in Obama's first term because of his recidivist policies, in which he was seen as pulling back and stopping US from influencing foreign policy in a way that it had been doing since the war on Iraq and previously, right? So we think that doesn't exist. But the distrust of the US in the Middle East exists regardless of whether US is supporting Israel or not. Because we tell you the war on Iraq, right, already has made everyone very extremely scared of US involvement within the Middle East. We tell you even before this, right, the propping up of the Shah in the Iran meant that most countries in the Middle East don't really care to agree with what the US wants within the Middle East, right? They are extremely suspicious of US involvement in any deals, and we tell you that is why anything, whatever Vanchit said doesn't make too much sense, right? What they can do though is bring both parties to the table, right? We tell you it's extremely impractical for CG to argue that we will promise everyone protection, right? Because this further reinforces the image of US as trying to do something, trying to protect everyone in the Middle East without knowing exactly what is the cause of the problems within the Middle East, right? We tell you people are going to be even more distrustful when US is seen as pandering to both sides without really taking a stance on what it is saying, right? We tell you the stance on Israel for US has been extremely clear ever since Israel was assigned to
as the place where the Jewish state could be set up after World War II, right? And we tell you this brings us to the exclusive extension that we are going to talk to you about, right? We tell you nobody has really spoken in this debate about why the US matters in this debate as well, right? And how US is going to face certain repercussions not only because of Israeli withdrawal of support, but also because of the demographic that exists within the US of the Jewish population, right? We tell you, one, there is a moral debt that is owed to the people of Israel and the Jewish people as a whole for putting people in, for setting up the state of Israel in the first place, right? We tell you the entire situation in Israel started off after World War II when these people were put there. So these people can't wash their hands off the issue and just say, like, we can't do anything more, we need to take a stance on the international forum. But also we tell you that this move is necessarily being championed by the Democratic Party, right? Which means Obama is being held accountable for the move away from Israelis. Republicans are necessarily chumming up to Netanyahu, Benjamin, where they bring him down to talk at their rallies, right? This happened with Donald Trump as well. They're able, so from being a bipartisan issue in the US legislature, where everybody agrees that Israel is an integral part of US's ally, is an integral ally to the US, it is going to become a bipartisan issue which is going to divide Democrats and Republicans, right? We tell you that is going to be extremely problematic for parties, because what's happening now is the Democratic Party is already not very favorable for the National Rifle Association, which forms the second extremely important lobby within the US, right? We tell you giving up the Jewish lobby as well is going to create a situation very similar to what happened with the Cubans and Florida, right? We tell you when the Cubans formed a majority within the Floridan state when they had escaped, right? The US's policy and the party policy towards Cuba often influenced how these people voted, right? We tell you the Jewish identity basically overshadows any sort of political leaning that might exist on the people's part. Right? This happens both in the USA and in Israel, right? But you also need to understand that it's the largest population of Jewish people outside of Israel, which is why the political parties that go forward with this move or that are seen as bringing this move to the forefront will face backlash from the population. We tell you the US has an active stake in Israel, and that is why we need to make sure that we are not just on their side, but mediating their interactions, not only with the rest of the countries in the Middle East, but also with the Palestinians and the international forum. But also, let's understand, right, why, again, CG doesn't make too much sense. Because they say that we will pivot away and get support from Iran and Turkey. We tell you, one, right now, we need support more than ever within the Middle East because of the advent of ISIS, where we need these allies to coalesce together and be able to fight ISIS. Now let's look at the people who are most likely to take up arms against, most likely to be allies within this situation. We tell you, Iran just got out of economic sanctions. They have been heavily injured by the kind of infighting that has happened because of the ISIS, and they are not really well equipped to fight ISIS on their own. So we don't think exclusively Iran can help us. But we tell you just that, like what Vachit said, right? We will pretend we are protecting both. We tell you Israel hates Iran. They have given us no explanation as to why Israelis will be okay with Iran suddenly supporting, like US suddenly supporting Iran and telling them, like, both of you are chummies, right? That's not going to happen, which means even if they don't actively distance themselves from Israel, the Israeli population will decide that that's the perception it's creating, right? The perception matters in this case, not what US says, because Middle East, nobody believes the US anyway, mostly, right? But also let's understand how the obfuscation happens on discussion, right? Because the Jewish identity is so important, within Israel, right-wing rhetoric succeeds. Only when the Jewish identity doesn't need to be protected is when you can have a discussion between the left wing and the right wing. We tell you, in Israel right now, the people who support left-wing ideologies are also on the side of the right-wing parties, which is why Benjamin is in power. It happens because they realize that even though they want human rights violations to stop, and they want Israel to become work towards a problem such as a two-state or
So, if you agree that Israel wants to self-preserve its Jewish identity, given it is surrounded by a lot of hostile neighbors, why will it not respond to possible economic and political sanctions?
We think that this will push Israel, and this is again a response to OG. We think it will push Israel to form allies relationships with other countries that is undesirable to the US and the world, right? Where we tell you this will create a vacuum for countries like maybe Russia or China to come in and say that we will now service whatever you did. And we saw this happening in Syria, right? Where US washed its hands of the responsibility that it had within Syria. We tell you Russia was able to walk in and necessarily guarantee things like tanks, guarantee things like aeroplanes, and the Syrian government lapped it up, right? We tell you that created an even bigger problem because now it looked like a proxy war on an international scenario, right? We tell you what happens now is that the more you start pivoting away from the US, the more scared the people of Jewish origin are going to be, not only within Israel but also outside Israel. This is going to influence US politics to a large extent. The party is going to be hurt, but also the champion of democracy within the Middle East, right? The one example that didn't fail, because Iran is a theocracy, right? And it's not really following democratic principles. We tell you we can't give up the idea of Israel. We can't be seen as antagonistic to their interests. And that is why we are very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. Government whip, please.
Am I audible? Madam Speaker, allow me to first summarize what our entire case has been and why it comprehensively defeats everybody's case before I move on to rebutting every point that has come out from the opposition text, right? So first we must understand what is the aim of this motion, what is the aim of the foreign policy of United States. It must be, like they said, to decrease their hegemonical power, right? To stop the active involvement that they have been doing in the past and the mistakes that have come from it, right? What they must focus on is, like we said, peace and stability in the Middle East and legitimizing and giving the perception of legitimacy to every decision that they take, and that simply cannot come when they give this blanket protection and support to Israel, right? Which is why we're going to talk to you about the three constructives. About one, how it increases the accountability of Israel when US removes this blanket protection that it has always been giving to it, whether it is in terms of veto to resolutions that put it at stake for the human rights violations that it commits so very regularly nowadays, or whether it is in terms of having a more meaningful Middle Eastern policy, or a third constructive about how it will be a lesser wealth-oriented policy, right? So first, when we talk about accountability, it should be understood that the international community wants to and needs to hold Israel to the standards that other nations are held to. And simply because US has historically been supporting it in the manner that it does, we believe this pivoting away, which is again not complete abandonment, we fail to understand why that is a characterization lent to it in this debate, is the reason why it will now be held more accountable, and this is the reason why it will be a better policy not just for Israel, not just for Middle East, but also more importantly for US, because the international community understands now where the US support really lies, and that is in the fairness and principles of humanity that the international community stands for, and not just a blanket ban for Israel, right? Coming to a second constructive about how it will provide a much more meaningful Middle Eastern policy, again, not just for the Israel and the Middle East, but also for USA. What we must understand is that the conflicts that have been taking place in the Middle East are something that have made a very polarized and unstable community in the Middle East, right? What we must understand is that US has a key role and incentive to play in this situation. If the US was to play a mediating role wherein it distances itself from Israel to the extent of which it has been providing support to it now, it will give it a much more important role in the Middle East, because currently it's viewed as something that's far too biased, right? It is viewed with a lens of distrust. It is viewed with a lens which furthers radicalization. It is viewed with a lens of hypocritical nature, right? What we must understand is that the continuous shielding of Israel is something which gives them this view, and if they were to not continuously shield it, but we're not advocating complete abandonment, right? What we must understand is that this middle position allows it to create a much more important role for itself in the Middle East, where it can
can bring parties to the negotiating table. Now the advantage of bringing these parties to the negotiating table is very important because the resolutions that would result from this, the negotiations and the result that would come out of this would be necessarily viewed as much more fair and legitimate because they're coming not just from Middle Eastern players, not just from Israel, but also from a party that has very important interests in that region, but is not too biased against one of the parties, right? That is why we must realize why it is so much more important for it to have a less biased Middle Eastern policy, which will lead to peace and stability, again, not just for the Middle East and not just for Israel, but also a much more legitimate view of the United States policy itself. Again, coming to United States policy, what we must understand is that if it is viewed as far more less wealth-oriented, if it is viewed as not just directed by a goal of few of its citizens who are Jewish and who are very wealthy and who we've been catering to historically, what we must understand is that it will not be viewed mostly as a simply wealth-hungry notion of foreign policy, right? It will be guided necessarily by those principles of morality, fairness, and the basic principles of humanity that the international community upholds and that the international community stands by, and which is why the United States must align itself to these policies as well, right? What we must understand is that our model provides to you an ability to provide US a much more comprehensive policy, whereas a determinant is not simply a forced approach of keeping supporting Israel no matter what it does and giving it the free hand and the free rein to do whatever it likes in the international arena, but holding it accountable and therefore creating a much more legitimate policy for themselves, right? Coming again to what the closing opposition said. So the closing opposition comes and talks to you about how there is a trend of stopping influence, and this is exactly in tandem to what we are saying, right? We are saying stop being the big daddy of Israel, stop providing it this blanket protection all the time, and this is and what they point out as the trend of stopping influence of the US in every arena is exactly in tandem with what we are saying. Again, coming to the point of how there's a flaw in the status quo Middle Eastern policy that they themselves pointed out, which is the flaw of having fear of US involvement, right? This is exactly what we're addressing. This is what we're saying when we say that US declines its influence. This fear of US involvement goes away, which provides a much more stable Middle Eastern policy to all the players involved, right? Again, not taken, sir. Also, we must understand that the change in status quo is important because the US is currently seen as supporters of Muslim oppressors. This is a view that is held primarily by the majority of the nations in the Middle East, and this must change. And this change can only take place when US pivots itself away from Israel, right? And this is the benefit that will accrue to it. What we must understand, also the example of how ISIS is related to it, that this is completely irrelevant simply because A, it is not linked to the Israel policy, B, the entire world seems to be united against it, and therefore it holds absolutely no value in this entire debate, right? What we must understand is that Israel might not like to, that their argument about how it incentivizes attention, right? We feel that's not true simply because even if US pivots itself away, it will necessarily bring Israel to the negotiation table, it will make it more accountable, and media attention, like they said, will still come to it, right? Also, what we must realize is their argument about how it will be pushed to, how that will be impeded for militarization, right? We address that by telling you again that because the blanket protection is not given to them, even if they were to further militarize themselves, they will be still held accountable for their reaction, and simply because of the fact that they're held accountable, they will not be able to undertake any action that they talk about suddenly becoming a rogue state, right? What we must understand is that in our paradigm, we produced a much more secure Israel, a much more responsible Israel, a much more accountable Israel, and a less rogue state, which is what would come out of the opposite side, right? Which is what would come out of US providing a blanket protection to Israel at all times, and this is why we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Governor. Opposition vote, please.
the underlying question still remaining relevant that government bench hasn't answered is whether the criticism and flack that has been diverted towards Israel is actually enough, and the pressure that's being put currently enough of a mechanism to actually pivot Israel into turning its policies away from the kind of atrocities that they think commit, right? Because the question still remains, Madam Speaker, as to whether pivoting away from Israel is necessarily going to put pressure on Israel to bring them to the negotiation table, right? Where all of our recent trends in terms of engaging with Israel have made it clear that they aren't really relenting on their position to much greater of an extent than they talk about. The comparative in this debate needs to be whether our presence in Israel and our support being extended to Israel makes it easier for us to have the sort of moderating influence that CG themselves have conceded is uniquely attributable to the US in itself. Which is why we think at closing opposition, the moral debt that we as the United States owe to the people of Israel and to the Jewish people as a whole needs to necessarily be mitigated by our active involvement over here in this area. We also argue to you why necessarily pivoting away from Israel further worsens our perception within these countries and exacerbates all the problems that they spoke about, right? But before we move on to what essentially our extension was and why that was relevant, a couple of clarifications that need to be made, right? Let's assume, for example, that the paradigm that CG presented could possibly be the one, right? Although we do think that it is directly at odds with what OG set up, which is like a complete lack of involvement in Israel. There should be strong clamping down on the sort of atrocities that they do commit. A couple of issues. First of all, if they want to argue along the weird line that we can still provide military aid and protection in wherever we seem fair, we think that that seems slightly dubious for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think the idea of you pivoting away means that you necessarily disagree with certain ideologies and principles within that region, right? So at the point at which you then feel the need to protect those people, we don't see why that's directly a clash or direct contradiction to each other. But two, the kind of things that they suggest is that we want issue by issue arbitration, right? We don't necessarily see how this is going to happen, or why, if they want minimal involvement at all, why the US is best placed to judge across the board, across the Middle East, which issues warrant their attention, right? Or which issues are more deserving of the sort of military protection they want to direct over there, right? But we think that further harms the US's perception of necessarily wanting to solve everyone's problems without really taking into cognizance the fact that there could be differential factors playing up in each of these scenarios. So we don't think that is something that they really reconcile. But the second idea that came from them, which was pretty much stood in both, repeated across both their speeches, right? The idea that the Middle East is necessarily going to be antagonized at the point at which US sides with Israel. First of all, we don't see uniquely why US's position in Israel, or not pivoting away from it, necessarily worsens this idea, right? We think there already exists a large amount of distrust within other Middle Eastern states, simply because of our previous interventions within these areas, right? Things like the war in Iraq. We think all of these have already attributed to a large extent the open distrust that these countries have towards the United States. So we think if their conclusion at the end of the day is one of image repairing, we don't really see how this is going to happen, when in fact they've taken on the arduous task of solving everyone's problems when they deem fit. So we don't really think their material stands. What did opening argue to you? Now the conclusions that both of these sides wanted was pretty much the same, right? That they want Israel to stop being evil. Now a couple of reasons as to why that won't happen. One, an abject lack of analysis in terms of what necessarily puts pressure on Israel to come to the negotiation table to begin with. Because the mode of which they want to operate is one that is necessarily confrontational, right? One that is directly polar, drastically different from all of our previous engagement within this season, within this area, right? Which means to the point at which we take back and there's a drastic shift in our stance over here. We're necessarily viewed as going back on the promises that we did afford to them in terms of protecting them, right? We tell you that what we argue from closing opposition was that we owe a moral debt to these people, not just because of the idea that we want to protect the Israeli identity, but because we decided that they are going to be put up in this place, right? That the creation of the Israeli state was largely something that we took on over here. And we think it's abhorrent for them to suggest that the Israeli identity, the idea of Jewish identity is something that they're just piggybacking along the lines of the Holocaust, right? Because we see that on a daily basis, their identity is under threat, where there continue to be constant attacks from Hamas, where there could, even the idea of the Munich massacre, right? The Six-Day War happened because the idea of the identity being under threat continues to plague these regions, right? So we think in that scenario, government bench, sit down, government bench has failed to acknowledge what necessarily is going to put pressure on Israel to bring them to the negotiation table. Because what we told you is that although they might consider their relationship with the US to be of some importance, we don't really think that it's more important to them than protecting this identity that they've necessarily established. But two, their second idea was that, look, the US hasn't, like, a lot of countries aren't able to engage in this place because of US presence over here. We don't really see that's the case, right? We do see a great amount of flack and criticism being drawn towards the kind of stance that's taken. So we don't think that's changing on either side at worst. But then last idea, in terms of why, to a large extent, the reason for propping up of ISIS is because of like US involvement in this region, right? We disagree with that, right? We think to a large extent our ability to be able to curb like the rise, like the resurgence of ISIS and the increase of this presence has largely been because of our presence in this region. Which means that on opposition and closing opposition, we've shown you why strategically we need to be in a position to place ourselves to deal with this rising like injustices and violences that are being committed from like insurgent like groups, right? So we think in that particular scenario, our ability to retain an ally within the Middle East is something that's significantly important. Sit down. But what we also told you is that there exists a large what we also told you is that in necessarily requiring an ally over here, the sort of like alternatives that government bench have proposed to us, right? The sort of other countries that they spoke about. We think Iran isn't really our best option over here because they're not really equipped to deal with the sort of things that we want to tackle, and they haven't really recovered from the sanctions that were earlier placed to them. But moreover, we think at the point at which we support this over like Israeli identity, one that's severely at odds with one another, we don't really think we can appease either of these groups over here. But moreover, it's farcical for them to suggest that we now go to Turkey, right, where there's already rising instability and rising unrest. So we don't think any of these strategic allies are plausible over here. We need to keep this away. But two, we tell you why the US's presence is important over here is because there's already some sort of good faith to suggest that we have received support from the US over this long period of time, right? Which is why Israel has become more accommodating towards things like UN forces coming in and giving them relief aid and things like that, right? Which to suggest that considering that this support has existed and this sort of a symbiotic relationship has existed for so long, we are willing to engage more on a constructive manner, right? We don't think that they necessarily dealt with that. But thirdly, on the idea of why the demographic that exists within the US plays an important role over here, right? The idea that the Jewish lobby is simply is an important stakeholder that we cannot ignore under this paradigm, right? Because in as much as we don't want economic costs to direct our foreign policy, we do think that it's a strong determining factor. We think our best ability to deal with these problems that they spoke about is to remain a support, is to remain an ally and not pivot away. Incredibly proud of us.
We ask you to just wash your hands and please go back to the hall. The result will be announced over there.
Guys, there's an announcement. All of the teams that debated right now and are in this hall, we will be releasing semi-final results here. Finals motion announcement will be here. Please do not leave the auditorium. We are pushing for everything to be within 10 minutes of now. Please don't leave. Semi-final results are going to be announced here. Finals motions are going to be announced here. Stay here, please.